Right, here we have Veracruz, Invasion of Mexico, 1847. This is a Berg game. This is a kind of weird one. And why I chose it is kind of weird too. I have no memory of this thing. It was not one that I picked up originally. The age is about the time that I picked up used games, but this is not one that I picked up in my early days of gaming, right? Pretty sure I didn't have it in the 80s at all. It's also, I've got a play recorded for it, no video, which leads me to believe it's not from the modern era that, you know, I started picking up games in, say, 2000, I don't know, 2010, somewhere around there, when I started getting back into my gaming and started dealing with stuff through BGG and whatnot. I have no idea when I picked this up. None whatsoever. It's filled with highlighter, which is weird. Like, had I seen it, I might not have bought it because of that. Like, had I seen it used and taken a quick look at it. Although maybe if it was in a sealed package, you know, like in a baggie or something, I would have just said, "Oh, it looks okay," you know, and not noticed these little color markings there, because there's not a lot marking this up, but there's a lot elsewhere, and it's in random places. I have no memory of playing it the first time. I don't, or very, very vague memory of it, but no idea of when, right? I've played a couple, I have a couple other games on the subject of the invasion of Mexico. I played Halls of Montezuma, which I found kind of interesting, to tell you the truth. I've got Rush for Glory waiting to be done, which had been on my want list for a while. This one is an oddity. It only covers, it doesn't give you, you know, the full strategic options that, like, those other games give you, where you can explore other forms of attacking Mexico. This one focuses only on the invasion from Veracruz and the successful path forward. Now, why did I pick this? Well, I've been reading, or I had been reading the rules to Plantagenet from the Levy and Campaign series, and I was making slow going through it. And after doing Battlefleet Mars, part of what I realized is I just don't feel like coping with modern era rules. They're like just more painful, and even though I know the core of the Levy and Campaign series, trying to pick through the rule book to find the differences and whatnot, or reread the whole thing, just wasn't appealing to me. I was only reading on my beanbag. I'm a little more hesitant about, like, sitting in the tub reading or on the crapper when it's the newer rule books for whatever reason. And I found I just wasn't making any time through it. So I said, look, let's get something else in, you know, that can fill me out, because Battlefleet Mars obviously didn't get me through that rule book. Maybe because I played too much of it instead of sitting and reading whatever. And obviously Raid eats up all my time. But I just went looking and pulled this one out for no apparent reason. And so let's go with it. Let's see what we got. This is a pretty standard looking war game of its era. It's got something that SPI started getting rid of, but they were using early on. And I think in this era they stopped doing this as much. But all the counters set up, you know, on the turn record track, and actually two different turn record tracks, one for each player. This reminds me of Winter War, had the same kind of structure to it. which makes things kind of interesting. This is definitely designed for two-player play for a couple of reasons, but you can see the way, each player has their own set of stuff on their side of the board. That's going to cause me issues, I'm sure, but having to walk back and forth and whatnot. I think they hadn't realized how much their games were played solo at that point. And you got your standard stuff. Terrain effects charts, a key. An important factor on the terrain is this little dashed line here. This is the yellow fever zone. I think everything on this side is subject to it, but I'm not sure. Maybe the other way around. What else? You have a couple of tables here for how much supply and when guerrillas get moved through, they get an attack factor. Standard strength points and movement allowance on each unit. Leaders have a movement allowance as well and a combat capability, leadership ability. This game is going to cover some interesting things. It focuses heavily on the effects of morale on combat, including national morale, but also there's some what look like painfully mechanically complex activities involved around the combat, where you're rolling dice, to see what the morale of the units are, and I think what the leadership value actually is, and then you combine that all and you roll yet another die to see what the actual combat results are. A more complicated dice rolling, a more singular dice rolling situation using a combat chart and just using these other things as modifiers might make more sense. We'll see that when we get to it. You got a bunch of you got an ad for Canadian Civil War. I didn't realize it was this old. I thought it was kind of a new game when I bought it, and apparently it was a couple of years old by that point. You got a bunch of the charts and tables over here, and again, like I said, you've got a bunch of different shit going on here. So it's got a normal combat results table, which we'll deal with. A way of calculating your casualties based on the morale as well. And the effects up here. Another thing just to allow you to calculate the percentage of loss. Again, a die roll for leadership on this, a die roll for your battle morale on here. You're going to be making all these different die rolls in the combat section, and it's really painful. Siege, you have bombardment and an assault tables, depending on what you choose to do there. And then you've got a table to handle disease and attrition during certain turns, which are marked in yellow for yellow fever. All right. The movement points for terrain, the only really cheap movement is on the National Highway. That's 1 per 5. So if you're moving along this, you can move very, very quickly, but obviously that's a choke point. Everything else on here, you're going to see roads going through stuff. Those are not bad. They're 1 per 2, so you're going to be able to move 2 hexes for 1 movement point. What this means is you're able to move very, very quickly across the board if you're using the right, if you're using the highway or whatever. And what you can see is the turns are, about a week each? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, about a week each. And obviously, forces can move quite far, even on foot, through a week. You have some other counters that I haven't addressed here. Some of these, the Mexican militia have an unknown strength, which might be a 0. Their guerrillas also might have a 0 strength, but they operate in a very different sort of way. The militia operate like regular combat units. You have aggregate units, these divisional and army units for the Mexicans, which provide you with a couple of things. One is they give you these boxes you can keep your forces in, which is all kind of weird because the way the forces, you're still able to see the top unit in the force and nothing else. That's how there's going to be a partial fog of war there, in addition to both sides don't know what the fuck, the militia are going to be like. But you also have certain combat advantages to forming your units into larger commands, which we will get into. You have supply counters and pack animals for the US so that they can try to push their supply through. Now, eventually, Scott decided to just cut off his supplies and keep marching for Mexico City. I don't know how well that's going to work. Yeah, you got markers to indicate general supply, which means out of supply essentially, and demoralized counters. The Mexicans are able to build fortifications near Mexico City. These are strength point markers. Most counters in the game, their backside is going to be 1 strength point less. You can see that here. And losses are going to be in terms of strength points. In order to mark additional losses, you use these markers. You also have ineffective markers, which the disease takes into causes to be placed. Basically, some percentage of each force on the board ends up ineffective. If you have a lot of forces on the board, anything with more than 1 counter, this doesn't feel like it's enough total counters to represent all the ineffectual markers. I may have to break something out. Fifth Frontier War comes in mind that has like percentage counters to use because there just aren't enough here, or I could use little slips of paper or whatever. Anything else? These little markers, as you siege the cities or the fortresses, they're going to be tracked on here as to how damaged they are. Okay, let's dig into the rules and let me try to figure out how I want to set this up. Yeah, I'm going to take a break to do that because it means that I have to use the file joiner mechanism, but I think this is going to take me a while. I tried to express, hey, why did I do this? And I think I avoided the main point, which is I really wanted to read rules that were readable. And I find the SPI style of rules so much easier to cope with. I kind of dealt with it, but anyway. Let's start looking. All right. So the Mexican player, so basic sequence of play for the game. The Mexican player is going to be checking his supply at the beginning of his turn, marking anything that's in general supply that's going to have penalties. He gets any reinforcements, mainly are tracked on here, but he does get some die roll reinforcements as well. He receives a couple of guerrillas. He's allowed 2 guerrillas on the map each turn once Veracruz falls. Then on turns 10 through 15, there's a political election going on. And Santa Anna is affected by this and might have to go back to Mexico. And he takes his army with him in order to help the voters, in order to campaign for his voters. Also, he can't really leave his army behind. Like, just the way that Mexican politics was, leaving your soldiers behind might mean that, like, your lieutenant decides to campaign by other means for election. Mexican player is allowed to move his units, very much like in most war games. However, there's overwhelming attacks where if you're next to an enemy unit or an enemy stack and you think you can just destroy it, you have like 7-to-1 odds, you can just declare an overwhelming attack. And if you're successful, after revealing, well, the enemy reveals the strength to show that you're not successful, or else you wipe it out. You're allowed to do reconnaissance actions as well to peek at some of the enemy units. You don't get to see their whole stack. Just probing and whatnot. And then Mexican combat, you get to choose to do a siege bombardment. Whenever you're doing a bombardment or an assault in a siege, you have to ask if the enemy wishes to surrender. This is not just surrender. This is more like honors of war. And you must grant it. You don't have to negotiate it or whatever. The enemy gets to leave the fortress. And so that's kind of interesting. And then you handle combat, which is either assaulting or fighting adjacent units. You're going to find the combat requirement rules a little weird in this. All right, we'll just go with that. I found a lot of stuff weird. And then for the U.S. side, the U.S. player has to roll a die to see what supply units he gets and what pack animals he gets. And then he gets to expend supply markers in order to supply units, I think, within 7 hexes, but I don't know. We'll hit the specifics when we get to it. But anything that he doesn't expend a supply marker, and he has a limited quantity of these, is in general supply, which is okay. I wish they didn't use the term general supply, but if you want to fight in battles, you probably want to be in combat supply, which requires the expenditure of a supply unit before you take your turn. Then the U.S. gets whatever reinforcements that they're scheduled to get. Is this when withdrawals happen? I don't know. They have withdrawals as well. Then the U.S. player gets to move his units. If he moves through a guerrilla unit, the guerrilla unit can be declared active and will get a chance, depending on how weak the force that's moving through it is, of being able to either kill a strength point or what it's more likely to be trying to do, wipe out supply and pack animals. Okay, I missed the rally phase in both cases. So, yeah, demoralization markers get removed from units. They're just demoralized for the extent of that period. And then they get a siege in combat as well. In between, every 4th turn, you have to check stacks to see if they are affected by disease. They will get those percentage markers. And that's just really, you take all their strength points and you subtract that percentage of strength points from them in terms of their effectiveness in combat. That's really it. Movement. Anything exciting here? Let's skip down through this because it's all pretty standard, except artillery batteries, except for the U.S. Naval Battery, have no movement allowance. They can only be moved if assigned and stacked with a division or army counter. When attached to those, they move with the allowance of that division or army, which is 7, which is a slower movement than any of the regular units, but it allows you to pull artillery with you. The U.S. Naval Battery has a movement allowance of 1. It may only move 1 hex per game turn, whether it's with a division or not, and it may never enter rough terrain, whether there's a road or not. Rough is this tannish color stuff. There's also mountain, which I don't know how you tell the difference. There's a mountain. Slightly more yellow. So there are a few of them. Can't enter those either, but it won't be able to. Yeah, so the Navy can only stay on this side of the board with their artillery. And it's a big, heavy artillery unit. U.S. naval units, there's 2 gunboats in the game. I didn't call them out. Get them over here. They have essentially unlimited movement allowance, but can only be in the Gulf of Mexico. They can't go up the rivers or anything like that. U.S. supply units have no movement allowance. They have to be transported by pack animals. Certain infantry regiments are marked as artillery, but they're just infantry units. They're basically like in the Civil War where artillery garrisons and whatnot were stripped off and used as infantry. You can't enter an enemy hex. There are zones of control which will stop you, which stop you from continuing movement. If you start in an enemy zone of control, you can leave, but you can't go directly to another enemy zone of control. You must move first into another hex. Okay, supply status of units affects your movement allowance. If you're in general supply, your movement allowance is only 4, regardless of your normal movement allowance, unless you're an artillery piece, in which case you don't get 4 free movement points for being in general supply and not in combat supply. Overwhelming attacks. Okay. If you are, this is done during movement. If you're adjacent to other enemy units, you can choose to declare an overwhelming attack. You announce this fact to the enemy player. You reveal the strength with which you are attacking. The enemy player checks his total strength, and if the attacker has 7 to 1 or greater, the defender is completely wiped out. If the odds are less than that, the overwhelming attack is unsuccessful, and the defender need not reveal his strength. And here they say, try to be honest, folks. It's only a game. And at this point, I said, all right, I got to check the designer, and yeah, it's Berg. Who was the... credits are kind of interesting on this one. So Berg's the designer. Developer is Berg and Balkowski. I'm always a little weirded out when I see that the designer is also a developer. I don't know what that means here. I really feel like if you're taking the development tasks on, they should be almost entirely separate from the designer's tasks. It really depends on what they are, right? Like, if you're talking about, yeah, my development task involved, say, arranging and sending out playtest materials, but not reviewing the reports of them, and not picking, you know, just groups that I had, that I was playing with or whatever, then I'm okay with it. But for the most part, I don't feel like that really deserves being called a developer anymore. So I'm very, very worried that, like, by taking on, by getting credits as a developer of the game, Berg essentially was taking on tasks that probably should have remained completely separate from the design tasks. Really, the designer should be representing his design. And, you know, he has the final word and whatnot, which means that the advocacy role that the developer has for both, you know, hey, we've got this many counters, you're going over the limits, or the players aren't finding this as good as you think, that really needs to be represented somewhere else. And I've made that point many times, mainly with games where there's no developer listed. Hello, Compass Games. Yeah. Okay. Where was I? Right. Leadership and morale have no effect on an overwhelming attack. It's just the strength points. Ineffectiveness does have an effect, though, on it. You can make multiple overwhelming attacks in a single movement phase as long as you have the movement points to do so. What does it cost you in movement points? This I had to look up. I think it costs you the move to get into the hex. I think that's it. If you move adjacent to 2 or more enemy-occupied hexes and declare an overwhelming, you have to direct it at one of those hexes. And when you succeed, you have to move into the hex. So, anyway. Zones of control. Combat units only exert zones of control. Which means supply units, pack animals do not, leaders do not, guerrilla units don't either. Guerrilla units occupy the hex they're in and the 6 surrounding hexes, and they don't affect anything unless they're declared to be making an attack, essentially. Demoralized units do not have a zone of control. Units in fortresses do not have a zone of control in general. However, see 12.15. Okay, I'll have to look. Okay, perote has a zone of control of sorts. And that's this thing. Here. Which I think is worth 5 victory points. Okay. What does a zone of control do? Well, it stops movement. It costs an additional movement point to enter a zone of control. It stops movement, like I said. You can't go directly from one to the other at the beginning of your turn. Friendly units can move freely through hexes that are adjacent to enemy that are not in an enemy zone of control. This can happen when there's a river. If we look here, we might have an effect. River hex side doesn't say here. So let's see where the exemptions to zones of control are. I'm not seeing anything. Okay. If you're in a zone of control at the beginning of a friendly combat phase, you must attack. But this is weird. You have to attack one enemy stack. You're allowed to attack more if you have like more than one leader or whatever. It's not necessary to attack all adjacent units, only one adjacent hex. This makes things kind of odd. Like a weak force holding, you know, you could have a weak force and a strong force, well, next to each other here, and if you somehow made your way between those two, you could attack the weak force and ignore the strong force. I don't fully get it, like the reasoning behind it, but okay. Supply can't be traced through enemy-controlled hexes unless there's a friendly unit occupying. I am not finding this exemption to the zones of control here. Like, I see IE across rivers, but... Oh, is it that rivers are... that you can't cross them? No, you can cross a river. Yeah, I don't know where that's listed. I looked at the errata for this and I saw almost nothing. Units in fortresses do not... Oh, here we go. They do not extend through mountain hex sides, all lake, all sea, or river. Okay. River is the only thing you can move across that they don't, you know, that seems a little weird. Okay. Stacking. Unlimited. You can move units that are stacked together if they have the same movement allowance. For a stack of units to move together, they must begin the movement phase in the same hex. Stacks can split during movement. Now, the only reason that you really want to stack is in order to do overwhelming attacks. Or because you have an organization like a division or an army. Stacks can split during movement. Any units that are left behind finish their movement. Units stacked together in the same hex may split their force and attack different adjacent hexes. However, each attack is going to require a leader. Yeah, all right. We're going to pause here because I'm feeling fatigued from reading. And I'll charge this up. Okay, so as promised, combat is mechanically complex. You total the strengths of your units, fine. You come up with an odds ratio, as normal, rounding in favor of the defender. But then you determine the leadership levels and morale levels of each player, adding these together to get something called a combat adjustment factor, or figure. This is then going to be used sort of as column shifts, but not quite. It's odds shifts, really. Because what you're going to see if I wish the charts were not embedded in the book, but this is, you know, a magazine rulebook. As you can see, there's certain odds levels that have multiple, or certain columns that have multiple odds on them. So, for example, if you get a combat adjustment factor of 2 levels and you're on the 3-to-1, you go up to the 5-to-1. You don't shift 2 columns. That's just one thing to keep in mind. Okay. And then organizational bonuses are taken into effect. I believe those add to the, I believe those are an additional column shift essentially, or odds shift. And then you make a die roll and take terrain into effect, which might be a penalty of 1 or 2 in the defender's favor. Okay. All units with a combat strength printed on them may engage in combat. Units moving without a leader are not allowed to attack enemy units. Now, something we haven't covered yet, it gets covered later in the rules. If you start without a leader in an enemy zone of control, you have to move out because you will be forced to attack and you're not allowed to attack without a leader. Units without a leader cannot attack enemy units. Here we go. They're not allowed to enter an enemy zone of control. Demoralized units cannot attack. Combat units in general supply only are allowed to attack, but they'll be reduced in their effectiveness. You're allowed to attack adjacent enemy units whether or not you're in the former zone of control. However, a friendly unit in an enemy zone of control must attack one enemy stack exerting that zone of control. As long as you attack one of the enemy stacks, you've succeeded in fulfilling your requirements. Attacks are done in any order the attacker wishes. No unit can attack more than once in any given combat phase, but overwhelming attacks are part of movement and don't count against you. You can attack an enemy-occupied hex by as many units as can be brought to bear from the 6 adjacent hexes. Attacks that are made at less than a 1 to 4 given an automatic F4. This may be incorrect. I have to look this up in the errata. There's like 3 pieces of errata, and I forgot to mark them down. But I think this is correct. F is failure, 4 is the level of impact. And we're going to see how the combat results table expresses things. It is a little weird. So A is advance, H is hold, R is retreat, RD is retreat demoralized, F is flight. Which are just, you know, it's worse than a retreat. It's like a rout. The attacker can withhold units from an attack, but they still take the effects of the attack. Now that's a little weird, and this is not covered in the errata. So if I'm attacking 2 different hexes, I might actually get a flight result or a retreat result, and then my entire stack has to leave and I don't get to make the second attack. But it also appears that I would get an advance result, which would allow me to advance, and I wouldn't get the second attack from that. I think that's bogus. I think you should be allowed to, if you are conducting 2 attacks from one hex, if one of them succeeds, you should be allowed to do the other one. As the rules as written don't allow that, but okay. Alrighty. So first you calculate out the strength and get yourself a column on the CRT. And there's a 3 to 2 column, which is used as normal. I don't think there's a 2 to 3. Then you determine morale and leadership level. And these are both going to, combined, are going to create your combat adjustment figure. And essentially, the difference in the combat adjustment figures is going to provide you with your values. The amount of not column shifts, but odds shifts that you have. And the results. Advance, the units affected may, oh, they don't have to, okay. I thought they had to. May advance into the hex vacated by the enemy unit, so you can leave behind units that you're intending to attack with. That's good. So it isn't a problem. And this will increase your national morale by 1 point when you get an advance. If the armies are big enough, I believe. We'll see. This is 10.14. Let's look it up because it is kind of important. Any position combat result of A results in the addition of 1 point. Seem to recall there was a size factor on this, but I'm not seeing it. Maybe it's any success. Okay. That's what it looks like there, but I don't know if that's the case. H is hold position, neither unit moves. R is a retreat. The forces have to retreat a number of hexes rolled on a die, and your battle national morale drops by 1. Retreat demoralized also decreases your battle national morale by 1, but you retreat 2 dice worth of hexes, and you get a demoralized result. And flight, you retreat 3 dice worth of hexes, and you get a demoralized result. And if you have artillery present, they're eliminated. They weren't able to get away safely. Okay. There are 4 different loss possibilities, 1 through 4. 1 gives the least possibility of losses. 4 represents the highest losses. These are taken before the position result is actually applied. The attacking player reads his loss probability number on the combat results table. He notes the battle morale figure that was used in determination of his combat adjustment factor, and proceeds to the casualty table. Then he rolls a die. Okay. So let's take a look at how this works. So I have a loss value of 1 to 4, which is going to be represented by this row. My battle morale level, which is not the basic national morale, it's based on that though, is going to range from -2 to +2. And then I roll a die, and I get a percentage of my strength that I lose. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to figure out your odds. You're going to roll a die on leadership, taking the leadership value of your forces, which is the average, rounded down, of all the leaders present on your side in the combat, and you roll a die and you get a number. That's going to be your leadership value. Your battle morale is a die roll modified by the national morale, and that gives you another value. The effective leadership and the battle morale are added together and then compared. So the defender's total of these two is subtracted from the attacker's total, and that is going to give you your number of column shifts that you get. Now, you have to remember your battle morale because that's going to determine your casualty chart that you're on. It's really, this Byzantine mechanical aspect that I would much rather see something like the Empires in Arms firepower versus morale loss table to give, which I believe gives a much more compelling story than rolling on a bunch of charts to see, hey, what was my morale, what's my leadership effect, etc. It feels so, I don't know. It doesn't feel like it's telling me the narrative, yet it's mechanically more complex than things that would. Anyway. Oh, where were we? We got through these, we got through the losses. Again, losses are represented by strength points. So you take a percentage loss, you figure out where the strength points come off of, and you reduce units by flipping them over. I don't believe you have any limitation to what you can take your losses on. The Mexicans can take their forces as they see fit. The U.S. must remove losses from his units as he sees fit, unless his stack has both regulars and volunteers. In this case, the U.S. has to remove one volunteer for every regular eliminated. This is, I think, poorly stated. There's an example or something. Yeah, here. If the number of strength points to be lost is an odd number, the odd-numbered loss must be a regular unit if at all possible. So you actually have to take 50-50 as much as possible, but you round in favor of taking losses on the regulars. It's not written as clearly as it should be. Units which are reduced to 0 strength are removed from play. These are not used as any kind of dummies or false units to confuse the enemy. I believe militia that are lost go back in the cup, though. Okay. If either side is using one of their higher organizational formations, they're eligible for a bonus increase in their combat adjustment figure. It's basically, I believe, one odds shift for having a higher organization, a division or an army. And after determining the final combat results, you check to see if the defending units are in a hex, which gives them a defensive benefit. That's going to be a penalty to the die roll of 1 or 2 points. Supply affects the combat ratio by affecting the morale level. If an attacker or defender has any units in his forces that are in general supply, he has to subtract 2 from his morale die roll. Okay, I'm not sure that's... There's something that gives you a proportional. It may be the higher units. The explanation for all retreat results are covered. Retreats are in hexes. There's nothing too exciting. You have to retreat towards your supply source. And the U.S. will probably be supplying through Veracruz, probably. Doesn't have to be. You can retreat through enemy zone of control, but for each one that you enter during your retreat, you lose 1 strength point, which isn't very much. You must avoid zone of control whenever possible. You can only retreat through them if there's no other route available. If you retreat through a friendly occupied hex, the units originally in that hex become demoralized, even if the retreating units were not demoralized. You can't enter the same hex more than once. Okay, here. If a force receives an A position result, remember that said you may advance. Now here it says you must advance into the hex vacated by enemy units. And this happens before any other combat takes place. And then note that all units stacked with units that have engaged in combat are affected by the results of that combat, whether or not those units actually participated. I think the may applies to this. The must is the force that's actually launching the attack actually has to do the advance. That's the only way to make sense of it all, but you could interpret it differently. If you become demoralized, you get a demoralized marker on you. You may not split. You must remain intact until you revert to normal. You can't enter an enemy zone of control voluntarily. If you begin your movement in an enemy zone of control, you must leave. If you cannot leave, you're eliminated. Any single demoralized unit in a hex causes all units to be demoralized. They have a morale level of -2. They don't roll for morale to consider the effect of the national morale. And these are removed in the rally phase automatically. The Mexicans can build fortifications. After the U.S. takes Puebla or advances to within 12 hexes, Puebla is over here. take a look, or within 12 hexes of Mexico City. The Mexicans can construct fortifications. The fortifications can be constructed within 4 hexes of Mexico City. You only have 3 of them that you can build during the game. To construct them, the Mexican must start his movement phase with at least 4 strength points, not including artillery. In that hex, can't be in an enemy zone of control. You place the fortification counter construction side up to indicate that it's building. These cannot move during the movement phase. At the end of the movement phase, the fortification counter is turned over to indicate the completion of the construction. Okay. Any units in that hex will gain the completed construction. There's no movement point cost for fortified hexes. Once placed, they may not be moved or destroyed. Either side can use them. And if you defend in it, you add 1 to your combat adjustment figure. So it's not a terrain effect. It's another CAF. Leaders can go anywhere on the map. They need not be stacked with units. They have no combat value. If they end up adjacent to an enemy force, they're destroyed if they're not with their own forces. Whenever a division or an army is placed on the map, there must be a leader assigned to that division or army. Could be more than one. Leaders have a movement allowance of 10, but only when they're on their own. Otherwise, they move with the slowest of the units they're stacked with. Friendly units without a leader may not enter an enemy zone of control. If you start a movement phase in an enemy zone of control, you must leave if you don't have a leader. If you can't, you get eliminated. Individual leaders is used as a factor for the final combat ratio. What you're going to do is, like I said, you average the total leadership values and you round 0.5 goes up. I thought it was truncate, but anyway. And that'll be your leadership level, your preliminary leadership level, which allows you to roll a die and get your actual leadership level, which will affect your adjusted combat ratio. Morale. Okay. There's a national morale. It ranges from -3 to +3. It starts out as 0 for both players at the beginning of the game. Any positional combat results can affect your morale. Okay, let's see. Any position combat results of R, RD, or F received by a player in a given combat in which he has used either a division or an army results in a loss of 1 point from his B&M. So this is a little different, right? Yeah, here it just says decrease B&M by 1 or increase B&M by 1. Now, this is going to feel kind of odd. So only armies and divisions affect your national morale. If you're forced out of a hex with an army or division, you take a B&M hit of 1. However, if you succeed with an army or a division, you gain a point of B&M. So this is kind of weird. Like, beating up on small forces helps your morale of your nation, as long as you're using your army or divisional size unit, which feels odd to me. It feels like you should get a morale bonus for defeating an army, but no. H has no effect. This is going to impact your morale level prior to combat, and that'll be a CAF value. Added to your leadership, gives you your CAF. Okay. In determining the Mexican player's final morale level, any stack containing the San Patricio battalion adds 1 to the final morale level, not to the die roll or to the B&M. The San Patricio was comprised to the greatest extent of U.S. deserters, mostly Catholics who objected to invading a Catholic country. And they were especially effective. Good luck remembering that. It's not going to be particularly specially marked. It's just a 2-8 unit. Okay, supplies. Supply is going to be an important factor in this. You're either in combat or general supply. Combat supply is the good stuff. Each player determines the supply status during their friendly supply phase. Okay, U.S. supply. Their sources are their supply units. This is the only way they can be in supply. To be in combat supply, you must be able to trace a supply line to supply units. It's no longer than 2 hexes, not 7, I was mistaken. You should trace a line from their combat unit to the supply unit and not vice versa. I don't know why it would matter. Supply lines may be traced through any terrain through which infantry could move. They may not be traced through an enemy-occupied hex or an enemy zone of control unless it's friendly occupied, which is slightly different. But a single supply unit can supply all U.S. units within the 2 hex range, and you expend it, it goes away, and can only be brought back through the U.S. supply table. Well, there's actually a supply unit on the board at the beginning of the game, and I forgot to set it up. Okay. And you will be in supply, right, for the entirety of the turn. All U.S. units are considered to be in combat supply for the game turn in which they enter the game without expending a supply unit. The U.S. supply units, they get them through the supply table, and there is 3 supply units and 1 pack animal at the beginning of the game that they also receive with their invasion, which I don't have over there, and I'm going to put them over here to help remind me. Oh. They get a roll each turn. These can be placed in the reinforcement box, in the reinforcement phase. Supply units are placed only in a friendly controlled port hex. Veracruz and Alvarado are the only ports on the map. We have Veracruz here. Where's Alvarado? Up here. That's worth a victory point. How about that? Okay. If the U.S. player does not control either of them, however, they can place the supply units in any coastal hex, in any clear terrain coastal hex, not in an enemy zone of control. This exception only happens if they don't control a port. It feels a little weird to me. I feel like you might be able to do something gamey because of this, and I operate without Veracruz for some reason. I don't know why you would want to do that, though, because Veracruz is worth 3 victory points, and you really want to, you kind of need to get almost all the victory points in the game. So you're not going to win the game without Veracruz, or at least you're not going to get the maximum victory without Veracruz. Supply units can never move on their own. They can only be moved by pack animals. When carried by pack animals, they assume the pack animal's movement allowance, which I believe is 7. It is. What's that 10? Oh, it's 10 if unladen and 7 if they're carrying any supply. They're allowed to carry 3 supply each. You're allowed to make additional counters in order to pull more supply in the game. The pack animals themselves carry the supply. They have a movement allowance of 10 when not carrying supply, 7 when they are. They have no zone of control nor combat strength. They're eliminated in the same fashion as U.S. supply units if they're in a zone of control. Each pack animal may carry up to 3 at a time. They're placed in a port. Like we talked about, eliminated units can be recycled. Okay, that's pretty much the U.S. supply side. The Mexican supply side, a Mexican force unit must be able to trace a supply line free of enemy units, enemy zone of control, or impassable terrain of any length to either Mexico City or to the road hexes, and they list 3, 01, 42, 05, 31. Let's see what. And there's another one. 2751. Which is this over here. Okay. Weird, but whatever. Any Mexican combat units inside fortresses are automatically in combat supply. Mexican combat units cannot trace such a supply line are in general supply. Combat units have two states of supply, combat and general. Division Army counters, Mexican militia with 0 strength, and U.S. dummies are considered to be combat units for this purpose. It affects their movement. Any combat unit that is not in combat supply is in general. If it's in general supply, it has movement allowance of 4, except for the U.S. Navy battery, which still only moves 1 hex. And normal batteries don't gain movement from 0 if they're not part of an army. If a force in combat contains any units in general supply, you subtract 2 from the die roll on your battle morale table. When determining the effects of disease and attrition, if there's any units that are in general supply, you add 1 to the die roll. And the Navy gunboats are always in combat supply. We're going to take another break here. I'm, just getting fatigued from what is relatively simple stuff. I don't know when I'll be back because I got to do some serious raiding. All right, on to sieges. So there's 3 fortresses in the game. Veracruz, the San Juan de Ulma, and Perote. They're each going to have their own counter, which you use over here to track the level of the siege on them. Okay. They have their own built-in defensive strength printed next to the name of the fortress on the game map. So I think that's a 10 under there, there's a 15 here, and just a little 5. Okay. This strength will be tracked on that chart, and this defensive strength is also its counter battery strength. Any units inside the fort or inside that hex are considered inside the fortress. Perote, however, can only hold 5 combat strength points. Any number of friendly strength points can pass through the Perote. There's no zone of control in Veracruz or San Juan de Ulua. Perote, though, does have a zone of control. If you're adjacent to that, you must either attack it with an assault or a siege. Enemy zones of control don't extend into a fortress, so they don't have to attack. And they're always considered to be in combat supply along with any units inside them. For the siege itself, friendly combat units can bombard it. If they besiege the fortress, it is besieged under the following requirements. All right, for Veracruz, all the land hexes surrounding the fortress must be occupied by enemy units or their zones of control. And you need at least 2 divisions at minimum strength. I think minimum strength is 5 units in each division. Otherwise, they stop being divisions. Perote, the attacker has to have 6 combat strength points adjacent to the fortress. Whoop, whoop, whoop. And San Juan de Ulua, you can bombard at will. If these requirements are not met, the attacker may not bombard. Siege bombardment is done in the siege segment. The ultimate aim is to reduce the fortress defense to 0. You total your artillery strength points adjacent to the fortress. You consult the siege bombardment table. Let's put this here, because all the tables are unfortunately here. And You count up your strength points, you roll a die, you get a value. If you get an asterisk value, some counter battery fire may have occurred and you lose a strength point. Now let's see about counter battery fire here. One supply unit can supply all bombarding units regardless of zone of control. If the units are in general supply, their bombardment strength is halved. Immediately after siege bombardment, roll the defending player. Die roll the defending player, if the fortress still stands, may roll for counter battery using the current counter battery strength of the fortress. I got ya. Yeah. So you actually use this same table for both things. The asterisk is if the fortification is firing and it uses its strength points back. Okay. And ignores any numbers. If you don't wish to besiege the city, or if you cannot, you are allowed to assault it. San Juan de Ulua may not be assaulted. Assault is quick but costly. In actual campaign, Scott decided against an assault on Veracruz, and his siege only cost about 50 casualties. Okay, that was helpful. You may assault an enemy-occupied fortress in the combat segment. Thus, you can bombard and siege and then assault immediately afterwards in the same friendly combat phase. There's no requirements to assault a fortress except you must have at least a 1-to-1 ratio. Leadership and morale have no effect. The defensive strength will be the combat strength of all units inside the fortress, multiplied by 4 if the defensive strength of the fortress is 6 or more, or 3 if it's 5 or less. You don't just add the fortress strength in there, it just determines the multiplier. You compare the combat strength of the assaulting units that are adjacent to the fortress with the strength of the units inside. And a ratio is determined, and you roll on the assault table, which is over here. And you get results. On the attacker will be a percentage loss, which is painful. And then on the other side, an unsuccessful result can still cause strength points to be lost by the defender. And what else? Otherwise, it's a success. Okay. If there are no strength points inside the fortress, it will fall automatically to an assault. Now, remember, this one cannot be assaulted, which is why it has no units in it to begin with. Prior to any siege, bombardment, or assault, the attacker can ask the defender to surrender. If the defender chooses to surrender, if they don't surrender, you bombard or assault as you wish. If the defender does surrender, he vacates the fortress and relocates all non-militia units to another city. The Veracruz militia is considered militia for this purpose. Okay. Artillery, militia, supply units, and pack animals are all eliminated, however, if they surrender. They may not relocate. If Veracruz surrenders, San Juan de Ulua automatically surrenders as well. If the surrendering player is Mexican and the surrendered city is Veracruz, the units may relocate to either Orizaba or Jalapa. I don't know where these are. Jalapa's here. Orizaba's over here. The surrendering, yeah. If both cities are occupied, however, the units will be eliminated. If the fortress is Perote, the units relocate to Mexico City. If the surrendering player is U.S., the units are relocated to any friendly occupied hex not within 10 of the city. This is different from what this says, isn't it? It says he may relocate all non-militia to another city. I'm not happy about that. I think it's got to be a friendly occupied city hex. If a surrender is accepted, the attacker may enter the fortress immediately. Once a fortress who's taken hits from bombardment is occupied by the opposing player, its rating can be built up again. I would say that this would also happen if the siege is abandoned. Each fortress adds 2 strength points per full game turn to its fortress rating, even if left unoccupied. Fortress can never be rebuilt higher than its original. San Juan de Ulua has special characteristics. Combat units never occupy it. There's no movement between it and the mainland, and the fortress may not be assaulted. It can only be bombarded. U.S. Navy ships must stop when they enter a hex adjacent to this town. And the San Juan de Ulua may fire counter battery at either U.S. gunboats or combat units in an adjacent hex. If Veracruz surrenders, so does San Juan. Okay. Disease and attrition. And calling it La Vomito is definitely, again, something, even if that is what the Mexicans would have called it, it's very Berg to put that in here. Starting with game turn 7 and every 4th game turn thereafter, both players roll a die during disease attrition stage. You roll a die once for each stack of combat units on the map, with an exception, 6.13. This is going to have to do with the line, I'm hoping. There's another exception too. Guerrillas. I think this may be a mistake, and I'm guessing it's some other thing. Oh, 16.13. Much better. And again, it has to do with guerrillas. It doesn't appear to have anything to do with the disease attrition, so the number is still wrong. It's just a different wrong number. Non-combat units are never subject to disease attrition. If only one combat unit occupies a hex at the beginning of the stage, the unit is exempt from rolling disease attrition. Division and army units are counted as more than one combat unit, so even though they're on the board as just one piece, they... For each die roll during the phase, you consult the disease attrition table, taking all modifiers into effect. We got the modifiers here. All Mexicans subtract 2. All stacks east of the yellow fever line add 2. But Veracruz only adds 1. Swamps add 1. General supply adds 1. And you get a percentage loss and possibly, a percentage in effective rating, and you may lose 1 strength point from it. Those percentage ineffectives will remain in effect until the next time the disease is rolled. If the stack splits or combines, it's always the highest disease effect. Strength points that are ineffective are considered normally, except for they don't get included in combat, siege, or assault, either attacking or defending. I think also for overrun, whatever that is. Limited intelligence. Okay, there's a few things that give you limited intelligence. One is the Mexican militia, which are these units that are marked with a U on them. Neither side knows what the hell's on them until they flip over. Once they do, the owner can inspect them. Basically, they remain face up as regular units. If they have a 0 strength, they stay on the map until they are killed. Unless the Mexican wishes to pull them off and throw them back in the cup, I don't know why you would want to do that.
During the first Mexican turn after the U.S. player enters and occupies Veracruz, the Mexican player rolls a die in his reinforcement phase to see if he receives a Mexican militia unit. In addition, he may receive others from the reinforcement schedule. There are some already placed here, and you get a random unit. Eliminated militia cannot be are placed back in the unpicked pool. Zero strength militia are not removed just because they're revealed, but they can be removed. They cannot be removed to satisfy a loss of combat strength. They are eliminated if all Mexican units in the hex are eliminated. Otherwise, they stay on the board unless the Mexican player wants to pull them out. Untried militia have a normal zone of control. Zero strength militia do not. They're just like dummies. The U.S. player has 8 dummies in his initial invasion. These units have no meaning or effect in the game except to confuse the Mexican player of the strength of an American division. They can be assigned to a division. They must be assigned to a division, but there's no limit as to the number of dummies that may be assigned to a given division. They move with the movement allowance of their division. Basically, they just pad the height of your stack and make it look like you've got more stuff. Reconnaissance. During the game, players may have large stacks of units deployed in various areas of the map. The owning player may always examine their own units. However, there are certain restrictions as to how the enemy may examine the opposing player's units. The only time that an enemy can examine the units of the friendly stack is during reconnaissance or combat, or if the friendly player is making an overwhelming attack. The top unit in a stack will always show, including the top unit in the division box, notably. The inability to examine the units described above applies only to units below the top unit. During a friendly movement phase, a U.S. engineer can make a reconnaissance against a Mexican unit. There's no additional movement point cost to reconnoiter, and the U.S. player announces it at the moment the engineer enters a hex adjacent to a Mexican. If so, the U.S. player rolls a die, doubling the result, and that is the number of Mexican units in the stack that may be examined by the U.S. player. This reconnaissance is only an interruption in the unit's movement. The U.S. player can continue the movement of the engineer, but it costs 2 additional movement points to leave the Mexican zone of control. This is something you can't normally do. You still may not move from one zone of control directly to another. The engineer would not be able to leave the zone of control unless he performed a reconnaissance. Let's go on. The Mexican has a similar cavalry units with an R on them. They do the same thing, but they don't double their reconnaissance roll, i.e. a 2 lets them see 2. When either player is permitted to examine the opposing player's units as a result of reconnaissance, the opposing player simply takes the units and shows them to him from the top of the affected stack, not including the topmost unit, yeah. After a short period, they're placed back in the same order. All units, including dummies, count toward the number of units examined. However, if 2 reconnaissance are made against the same stack in the same phase, the second one can go deeper into the stack. If a division or army counter is being reconnoitered, that counter itself doesn't count towards the units examined. Rather, it's the stack of units in the box. Single unit may only reconnoiter once from a single hex in a single movement phase. If the unit has the necessary movement points to do so, it may reconnoiter more than once from different hexes in the same movement phase. The Mexican cav can also continue their movement. Not all Mexican cav have an R on it. You'll see some of these do, but some of them are the battle cav, they do not. Dummy units in zero strength militia are not removed just by being reconnoitered. They remain on the game, unless the Mexican wishes to remove his zeros. Divisions and armies. Both players can combine their units into divisions or armies. The minimum requirement for a U.S. division is 5 combat units, excluding artillery, and 1 leader. The minimum requirement for a Mexican is 6 combat units, including militia but excluding artillery, and a leader. No division or army may have more than 3 artillery units of any size. And remember, most artillery can't move unless it's in one of these big formations. At any time during a friendly movement phase, the above requirements are met. You can form them into an organization. You simply remove the units from the game map and place them in the appropriate box. And then you put the division or army on the board. U.S. dummies and revealed zero-strength Mexican militia will not satisfy requirements for size. However, they stay in the stack. The following units are not part of a division or army and may not be placed in an organizational box. They must remain on the map. Information markers, well, some of them probably should be part of the division, to tell you the truth. Which is to say, like, if a combat unit has a 1 strength point marker under it, it's going to be pretty confusing if I don't have that with the combat unit. So, supply counters and pack animals. And again, I'm willing to put them in there just, for ease of play, just not in the same stack for reconnoitering and whatnot. They're always visible. You can disband formations as you wish, reversing the procedure described as above. If the strength organization fails, the organization is disbanded. You may withdraw units as long as you maintain your strength. If you don't maintain your strength, you can still withdraw units, but the division falls apart. Can never be eliminated from play. You can bring them back if you lose them. The U.S. player may never mix volunteer and regular units in the same division, with the exception of the Kentucky and Louisiana volunteer companies, which actually start out as part of regular unit divisions. When either a U.S. or Mexican force engages in combat and at least 75% of the force, guessed by strength, is a division or army, the effector player can add 1 to his combat adjustment. Both sides can get this. I'm going to have to pause here. All right, just a little bit more, I guess. Mexican guerrillas. Once Veracruz is captured, the Mexicans made extensive use of guerrillas. Yeah, that's just historical. Mexican player can deploy the guerrillas at certain states in the game to disrupt the U.S., and those will create guerrilla attacks, trying to get rid of supply and pack animals for the most part. They get 6 guerrillas in the counter mix. The front of the guerrilla just has a G on it. The reverse side has a combat strength. Guerrillas are placed untried side up. Neither player knows what the value of the guerrilla is, which is also the case with the untried units there. They have no movement allowance. Once they're placed, they can't be moved until the next guerrilla phase. After the U.S. occupies either Jalapa or Orizaba, which are these two, or Puebla. Puebla's all the way down near Mexico City. The Mexican player can put 2 guerrillas picked at random on the game map. They must be placed in separate hexes. Any non-clear terrain hex, at least 3 from the nearest U.S. combat unit, cannot be placed in a village, town, or city, or fortress. They can only have 2 on the map at any given time. During the guerrilla phase, the Mexicans can change the locations or place new units on the map to fill out. The 3 hex radius requirement is only in effect during placement. If the U.S. moves into range, they stay, which is important because that's how they attack. Guerrilla units have no effect on any game function until they're activated by the Mexican player. So the U.S. can walk right through them unless the Mexican player chooses to activate them. As soon as they're activated, whatever they do, and then they're removed from the board, and you go back in the cup. They occupy the hex they're in as well as the 6 hexes surrounding it, as long as none of those are separated by impassable terrain. This is not a zone of control. They're actually in all 7 hexes. Each has on its reverse side a number, which is its combat strength. This will be one of the columns on the guerrilla attack table. And we'll take a look at that. I don't know if I'm happier. So obviously I would rather, a separate player aid, right? But in the magazine that wasn't going to happen. So the question is, would I be happier if they were on the map? Because there's a lot of space being used on the map that maybe didn't need to be, like these turd record tracks with all kind of units on them. But it's kind of easier to look things up here. All right. I am not seeing it. Maybe it is on the map. There we go. All right. So you look at the guerrilla strength, you roll a die, and you get a number. If that number is greater than or equal to. If that's higher than the total number of U.S. combat strength points in the hex, a loss will occur. And that loss is either killing one U.S. combat strength point or eliminating all supply counters and pack animals in the hex. So, I mean, obviously it's meant to hit the supply points, but you might not have that option. All right. Mexico. Mexico has a political phase. Starting on game turn 10, continuing through turn 15, the Mexican player rolls a die to see what happens with Santa Anna. If you roll a 1 or a 2, Santa Anna in the ensuing movement phase has to head towards Mexico City. He has to take at least 20 effective combat strength points and take the most direct route to his capital. I don't know what happens if he doesn't have 20 with him. While he's traveling to Mexico City, the die roll is suspended. When he reaches Mexico City, he has to remain there for the game turn in which he reaches. And then he will continue rolling on a 1 or a 2. He has to stay in Mexico City. Otherwise, he can go do other stuff. After turn 15, you're not going to roll anymore. The election's over, and presumably he wins. If Mexico City is occupied or U.S. units are unreachable because of zones of control, Santa Anna can ignore it. The city, okay, and one more political rule. The cities of Mexico, the generals were reluctant to actually fight inside the cities. The U.S. player will get 1 victory point each time a Mexican force defends inside either Puebla or Mexico City. Now, cities give you the big -2 die roll to the attacker. So there's strong value to defending inside, but 1 victory point is a lot in this game. The gunboats, they have a combat strength that can be used for siege bombardment. You have to place them in a hex adjacent to a target hex and add the strength to any other bombarding strength points. They may bombard by themselves. If they're adjacent to both Veracruz and San Juan, they can bombard either city. The Mexican player can fire counter battery against a gunboat. If the gunboat takes a loss, it's removed from play for 2 game turns, but then comes back. Reinforcements are tracked over here for the most part. The Mexican player gets them as per the schedule. Places new units on the indicated hex. The hexes are indicated on there. Moving them during the ensuing movement phase if he wishes. They do not pay a movement cost for the initial placement hex. They can be withheld except for militia, which are rolled for. But if they are unable to enter because their hex is controlled by the U.S. player, they must be withheld. Now, later I think it says they actually just disappear from the game. I don't care which. The U.S. player gets reinforcements from the schedule as well for their combat units over here. And also from the supply table for supply units and pack animals. They must arrive at a port unless the U.S. doesn't have one. In the latter case, they can be put on any coastal hex not in an enemy zone of control. These can be allocated to divisions or armies immediately. whether formed or not. They may not form divisions or armies until the reinforcing schedule indicates. So the U.S. doesn't get their 4th division until turn 17. And I believe I have that on there. Okay, first turn invasion. On game turn 1, the U.S. has to choose a coastal hex in which to make his invasion. This cannot be enemy-occupied hex. It may not be a land hex adjacent to San Juan de Ulua. However, it may be in an enemy zone of control. All invading units enter in the same invasion hex, including supply units and pack animals. Regardless of terrain, all U.S. units have a movement allowance of 3 hexes, not movement points, on the first game turn. The hex of invasion counts as one of them. Overwhelming attacks and reconnaissance can be made on the first game turn. There doesn't appear to be any cost, except you've got your 3 hexes, so, you know. All U.S. units are in combat supply for the first game turn without expending a supply unit. The U.S. player must land all his units on the first game turn. He may form divisions before landing. The Mexican player may not place a combat unit in any non-city coastal hex at the end of his first movement phase. However, there's an optional rule that allows them to do so, but then the U.S. can make an overwhelming attack against Mexican coastal hexes in the opening game turn. If the attack fails, the invading units may not land that game turn. U.S. withdrawal of volunteers. Most of the volunteer U.S. units' time ran out in the middle of the campaign. Volunteers have a V on them on their counter. For easier clarification, all units with a state designation or that arrive on or after turn 14 are volunteers. It's actually pretty clear, but for the purpose of this section, artillery units are neither regular nor volunteer. They may not be withdrawn, and they can be assigned to any division, volunteer or regular. Remember, you can't assign, the volunteers and the regulars are in different divisions, with the exception of the 1st Tennessee and 1st Kentucky volunteers, which are part of regular units. During reinforcement of turn 13, the U.S. player must remove from the game map 13 combat strength points worth of volunteers. These points are eliminated for the remainder of the game. If there's less than 13, he must remove all of them. And they're just removed from the game map, regardless of where they go. And obviously, this historically caused issues. Basically, half the army left. At the end of the game, victory is calculated by what you own. The U.S. player gets the only victory points. They control cities if they were the last to go through them. And Mexico City is worth 6, Puebla is worth 4, Veracruz is worth 3, Jalapa is worth 2, and 3 other cities are worth 1 each. The U.S. has to get 16 points to get a decisive victory. The Mexicans have to limit them to 8 to get a Mexican victory. Now, if we look, there's 10, 15, 16, 17, 18 points, which means the U.S. has to take almost everything. And notably, Mexico City is among them. Historically, they got all 18 points. They talk a little bit about, hey, you know, if you can limit the U.S. to less than 10 points, consider yourself the historical winner. It's like this muddled thing. They give you a victory point track. What that really comes to is the game as written, I guess, was about 45% victory for the Mexicans. So they're trying to balance it a little bit by changing the rules. And I don't know why you would do differently, like why the victory points in the game, you know, I don't know. Setup rules here, some nice designer's notes on it, always fun to read those. And then we got the charts and tables, and the advert for Canadian Civil War. I hate that there's an advert on the back. It would be much more useful to have charts and tables there. Obviously, you know, it's a magazine. They want to use up the space as efficiently as possible, but I don't know what they could have done. I can't think of an answer. I mean, again, there's two things of charts and tables, so it's not like they could have just fit it all on the back page. Could have put a counter scan in there. I don't know. Anyway, gonna start. I don't recall being blown away by the game. But on the other hand, it is a little bit more complex and has some interesting concepts in play. So I'm curious to see how it goes. It's been a while, obviously, since I've played it. Let's send this up.